All right. So the second chapter that I asked you to read. So the first chapter we read was the introduction. That's what the content that I just went over. The second chapter that I asked you to read is called Healthy Bonds, and it's the chapter that focuses on public health, which I felt like it seemed apt for us to read that particular chapter. And so one of the questions that I want to pose to you, one of the questions that I'd love for you to reflect on in the comments below this video is this question about the U.S. healthcare system, medical system as a system. So think of healthcare in this country as an electrical grid, right? We can very easily get our heads around the idea of an electrical grid being taxed, being overwhelmed, and causing it to not function as a result. So in what ways can we use that analogy, our health system being like an electrical grid, being like a more engineered system? In what ways can we use that analogy to help us understand how it is currently being overwhelmed and what that means for it? Can our health system be resilient in the face of coronavirus? Can it absorb and metabolize this many very sick people all of a sudden? And is there, if we could leave our homes, is there a way in which social infrastructure could make a difference? A way in which social infrastructure could help absorb, mitigate some of the stress and the overwhelmedness that is being placed on our healthcare system, that our healthcare system is being burdened with at this particular moment in time. And so homeboy Klinenberg mentions a number of public health crises in our country that are specific to this decade or this millennium, and makes the argument one by one that if social infrastructure were better, if we were investing in social infrastructure, that would go a long way to mitigating these crises. And so obviously he didn't write about coronavirus, so that's what I want you to do in the comments below and also in your final papers for this class. So one of the crises that he mentions, one of the public health crises that he mentions, is the opioid epidemic. And you can see on this graph here, synthetic narcotics, mainly fentanyl, have increased, deaths by fentanyl have increased between 2013 and 2017 from 5,000 to 30,000. That's nuts. You can see prescription opioids also growing quite a bit. Heroin is the green line, and so heroin actually has grown more rapidly as a killer. These are deaths now, so not use, but as a killer. And all of this, let's see, heroin really starts to spike, sorry, no pun intended, in 2010. And fentanyl really starts to spike in 2013. And prescription opioids don't really have a spike. It's a curve, but it's a steady growth curve. This next graph, national drug overdose deaths involving any opioid. So here, all the different opioids, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's a prescription, whether it's heroin, are all aggregated together. And then you see trend lines here for male and female as well as overall deaths. So overall deaths, 99, we were looking at something like 9,000 people a year dying from opioid overdoses. And we hit a peak in 2018 of 47,600. So, and you see I mean, it grows every single year from 99 to 2017. But the biggest year of growth, it looks like to me, was 2015, because in the gap between 2015 and 2016. So, what's happening in our world, in our society, that is responsible for, what are the causes, what are the catalysts of this pretty radical increase in opioid related deaths? Um, so Eric Klinenberg would say, well, a lot of it has to do with this enemy, with this isolation, with the, all these things that I showed you in the very beginning of the presentation: inequality, polarization, segregation, the simple fact that the social infrastructure doesn't exist for us to come together. The parks aren't there. The sidewalks aren't there. The malls aren't there. The bars aren't there. And if they are there, we can't get to them. Why can't we get to them? Well, maybe because we can't afford them, because poverty is so rampant today. Maybe it's because we don't have anybody to go there with, because we are so isolated. Maybe it's because we're spending so much time on social media that it doesn't even occur to us to go there. So, this is not absolute, right? I mean, you might say to yourself, yeah, I go to a bar all the time. I hang out in coffee shops. I take my kid to the park. I'm, using the social infrastructure. Yes, but it still looks, and we're talking about people that do use it and can use it and can access it, it still looks very different in 2020 than it did in 1940. Another of the public health crises that Klinenberg describes in this chapter is food deserts. For those of you that don't know what food deserts are residential areas, or areas where people live, in which there are structural obstacles to having consistent access to affordable, healthy food, right? So you might live in a place where the nearest grocery store is 4 miles away, but you don't have a car, and you got to take 2 buses to get there. And when you get there, it's a Whole Foods, and you can't afford to even buy a loaf of bread. So you end up, out of convenience and out of necessity, getting what you need to eat from the corner store. And so, it's like you're eating, snack cakes and quarter waters and chips and these things, right? So that's what we mean by food deserts. Places where not that there isn't food, and not that there isn't healthy food, but that there isn't easy and consistent access to healthy and affordable food. That's what we would call a food desert. And this map here, this is actually, you can map the entire United States on this map if you go to the Economic Research Service and look for it. It's the Food Desert Atlas, but I just threw on an image of Chicago here because it's a place that we're all familiar with, or most of us are familiar with. So the green sections here, these are census tracts in Chicago that are classified as food deserts. A third, maybe not public health crisis, but theme that Klinenberg draws out in this chapter is the issue of our aging population, right? So we live in a country in which every year the average person is older. And right now, the average person's still in their 30s. But if that trend isn't reversed, the average person's going to get older and older and older and older. And you know that older folks are more isolated, much more likely to live alone, much more likely to have little contact with friends and family, likely to live long distances away from friends and family. And older folks are less mobile, and so they have a harder time getting out, going to these third spaces, going to places where they can take advantage of social infrastructure. Many of them live in places that don't have areas in which they can congregate, they can get together, in which they can exercise, and so on and so forth. And so building that kind of social infrastructure to accommodate older folks is really important for us in the United States because we are an aging society. The baby boomer generation, which was a very numerous generation, they're not babies anymore. They're old people now, or getting there anyway. And so we are arriving at a cusp at which our elderly population is going to begin to stress our systems in ways that our systems probably are not prepared for. And this is just a little graphic, a little image that shows aging in our country. And so you can see the percentage of our country that is older than 65 has been growing. Or this is projected actually 2016 to 2060. So this is a projection, not a historical timeline, but will be growing. And then the number of children under 18 will be shrinking. And so we'll get to a point where those two lines cross, and it looks like that point will be 2030. So that's not too far away from now, 2030. Y'all will be in your early 30s. So what kinds of social infrastructure might we need to reinvest in, might we need to reinvigorate to accommodate an aging nation? And then the fourth public health issue that he brings out is what is often referred to in popular media as the obesity epidemic. There's been some very good social science over the last 15 years critiquing the idea of an obesity epidemic and tying that in with a critique of a fat-shaming society and a body normative society that creates a lot of problems for people, a lot of emotional problems, a lot of health problems because of eating disorders, a lot of body image dysphoria issues and that sort of thing, things that almost all of us are not immune to. So I say all of that to say that I'm going to go ahead and talk about the quote-unquote obesity epidemic, but let's remember that I'm doing so in a context in which there's a lot of good social science out there that says, wait a minute, what's up with this body normativity stuff where doctors think that you have to be skinny to be healthy, right? We associate thin and health, we associate weight or heft with a lack of health. That's not necessarily true. I mean, I had my son's pediatrician when he was like 2 years old said he's overweight, you got to put him on skim milk. So this is something that our medical community has really internalized, and it's problematic in some ways because you can be skinny and not healthy, and you can be hefty and be in great health. And so, our species is a species that comes in all shapes and sizes. And so to put these brackets around, like, this is a safe shape and size, this is an unsafe shape and size, it's problematic, to say the least. So I want to say all of that, and then I've said it, and now let's look at this graph of the quote-unquote obesity epidemic, which is legitimate. People are heavier now than they used to be. Okay? Whether you call it obesity and whether you call it an epidemic, those are good sociological questions. But it is an empirical question. People weigh more on average now than they used to. And so this graph bears that out. So if you look at the orange line, this is obese men. And obese men rose from 10% to over 30% over the course of the last, 70 years or so. And the same for obese women. So you'll see that overweight men and overweight women are mostly stable. So those numbers don't seem to be growing, but obese men and women those numbers are growing, which I'm going to assume basically means that people who were overweight before are obese now, and people who were sort of standard weight before are now overweight. And that's why the overweight numbers are staying steady and the obese numbers are going up. And then this is children. So the previous slide was adults, and this one is children. And the children thing is even more stark because, it's just children have metabolisms that should allow for them to just, eat a bunch of shit and still, be fine. But if we look at this, let's see here. Let me try to sort this out. So the green line is 6 to 11-year-olds, and in the 1960s, it was less than 5% who were obese. And in the 2010s, it's over 15%. And 12 to 19-year-olds, so teenagers basically, in the 1960s, it was also less than 5%, and that's up to around 20% in the 2010s. So those are pretty steep increases. So again, whether you call it obesity and epidemic, it is undeniable that average weight is on the rise very steadily, and that poses some problems, right? It poses some public health problems. And so how does our health care system absorb this, and what kind of social infrastructure could we invest in, could we develop, could we promote that would help mitigate this? So for example, if people were not inside so much, if we were out in parks and less isolated, so that we had more friends, so that we were running around outside like kids did when I was a kid in the 80s, and you get home from school and run over to your neighbor's house, and you'd be outside running back and forth playing in the woods or whatever, all afternoon until dinner time. We don't really do that anymore. My son doesn't do that, and that's in part an outcome of the deterioration of our social infrastructure. And so I'll leave you with this question, which is, we've gone through a bunch of public health crises, slow motion crises, which are different from the coronavirus, which is it's a tsunami. It's not a slow motion crisis at all. But opioid deaths, addiction and deaths, obesity. What was the other one? Aging population, and there's one other that I'm spacing on. But those are really slow motion crises. This thing that we're living in right now is happening so fast that it's making our eyes spin. But how is our system, our medical system, is it going to be able to absorb this? And what kind of social infrastructure can we invest in, develop, and promote to help our medical system absorb this, to help it be more resilient in the face of this just tremendous and truly unique thing? Okay, this has been a long lecture, but I'm going to leave it there. Um, and I look forward to some really robust comments and some really moving, reflective final papers on this subject.